Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Megsy, and I do kind of long book reviews. And today I'm going to be reviewing all of my October books, which was a total of 9. A lot of these books were sort of horror-themed adjacent, supernatural elements, a little bit of dark academia, fall-ish type vibes. So I'm not going to sit here and gab a lot. I don't think I can finish all of this before the sun sets. So we're just going to get right into it. If I change outfits, positions, it's because I have filmed this over the process of 2 days. But if you're interested, please stick around and we will get started. And as always, the timestamps of each book will be listed down below. The first book I finished in the month of October was a debut called Doll Parts by Penny Zang. This is a sort of 90s nostalgia, slightly dark academia vibe of two friends who are super close in college, and then they grow apart over this traumatic events that happen, and we switch back and forth between their time in college in the late 90s and the present-ish. So the story begins with the one friend, Sadie, who is the wild one of the pair, who is living in Nikki's house with Nikki's husband, and she's had a baby with him, and Nikki has died under mysterious circumstances. And Sadie moved in like a year later. That part was really weird and it's not really explained. I mean, it kind of is, but whatever. And so Sadie doesn't believe that Nikki took her own life, and she begins to reminisce about their time in college together and the stuff that happened. And there's this sort of college lore of where they went, where young women since the late 60s had been mysteriously killing themselves at the college, and they were dubbed the Sylvia Plath Club, these string of suicides that kept happening. And Nikki at the time was researching this. And apparently, up until her death, she continued to research it. So we get sort of like a murder mystery kind of built in there. We flash back and forth, like I said, between the 90s and the present, and a couple of like sketchy professors that are at the school. This was written as a mystery, but it lacked the cohesiveness of that aha moment that mystery and detective novels have. I think it's difficult to write a mystery because I personally have tried to write it and I've struggled, and so the killer, so to speak, is somewhat obvious, but like there's not, it just doesn't really gel cohesively together, and the writing feels very YA. It feels very juvenile and simplistic, even though this novel isn't billed as YA. I don't know, there's just something about it that feels very young. I also wasn't completely sold on Nikki and Sadie's friendship. It felt very surface level. It just sort of felt like a TV show of like what writers, TV show writers imagine a girl's friendship to be. And the whole thing of Sadie living in Nikki's house and going after her husband after Nikki is dead is really weird, and it's not really, that was like a weird aspect. I just wasn't buying it. I was unconvinced. Even just like the writing sometimes, besides being juvenile, it felt like an outline. Like the author would, if she's talking, for instance, about a song that's playing in the background, because 90s alt-rock music features a lot into this book, she would write choppily, like, Seether by Veruca Salt as a single sentence, rather than weaving it in the background music into the scene. And so, like, the clues that sort of, like, add up in the end, it just sort of felt like, rather than a build-up, more of a sigh. I was just not really convinced or liking this. I gave it 3 stars, which is kind of generous. Again, Goodreads does not allow half a star, so. But, it just felt very half-baked to me, and the friendship felt cliche, and the whole execution just fell flat. So, yeah, it just felt very rough drafty to me. I didn't really care for this at all. I am so sorry. So, unfortunately, I cannot really recommend this. The next book I finished in October was a novella I picked up in a little lending library, and that was The Most by Jessica Anthony. I have seen this around on booktube, and I was delighted to find it in a little lending library. I do really love the cover. Unfortunately, I don't love the book itself as much as I love the cover, though. This was okay. I think the writing was better than Doll Parts, so there's that. So this is a novella about a couple in the late 1950s in Delaware suburbs, and the wife, Kathleen, one day on a unseasonably warm November day, she walks into the apartment complex pool and she stays there and she doesn't come out, and her husband is kind of getting annoyed and then worried, and he goes about his day, and then he sees she's still in there. And we get into a lot of like the interior monologue and flashbacks of this couple and their lives and what has brought them to that point, their backstories. Kathleen was this not famous, but she was a fairly talented tennis player in college, and she had this relationship with her coach that didn't work out for various reasons. And then she ends up, falling into this like 1950s domesticity. And then her husband is also like yearning for something more. He's an insurance salesman, and both of them have multiple affairs and cheat on each other. So we learn about their various infidelities. I expected more of this. I thought it would be darker. I thought the character Kathleen would be more depressed and suicidal. I mean, she is obviously depressed, but I just didn't really I don't think I understood her motivation, particularly one motivation for certain actions. It felt really random. And I didn't quite get the 1950s feel, other than people talking about Sputnik and the space race. It just didn't really have that vibe to me. I think in general, I'm kind of tired of 1950s suburbia because I feel like it's so overdone at this point. And if you're going to write about this era, then the writing better be like really top notch, or you have to be adding something new to it that hasn't been done before, because otherwise it just feels like regurgitation. So I just it was okay. It wasn't bad. It wasn't great. I just felt it was like a standard 1950s domestic drama about two people that have various infidelities and how that unforeseen has impacted their marriage. Yeah, I don't know. It was just mediocre. It was whatever. The next book I finished was House of Beth by Kerry Cullen. I saw this randomly at the library, and I thought the cover also looked beautiful. And this is a lit fic gothic sort of tale. It's really unsettling in the mundane, even though there is a supernatural element to it. So we follow a woman named Cassie who lives in New York City in the publishing industry, and she, due to like a series of rash events, she completely upends her life. She breaks up with her girlfriend, she abruptly quits her job, and she moves back to her hometown somewhere in New Jersey. And while she's there, she ends up reconnecting with this old high school friend, Eli, and they end up becoming romantically involved when before in the past they had been strictly platonic. And she ends up just abruptly marrying him and moving into his house and becoming a stepmom. And Eli's wife, Beth, died. She was like a deeply religious woman. And again, under mysterious circumstances. So like I said, there is this supernatural element to it and kind of a mystery element, so to speak, although it's not really written that way. But the most unsettling thing about this is Cassie's mind. And she suffers from OCD, specifically harm OCD, which is where you imagine these really violent scenarios happening to people around you, people you love generally, but you imagine that you are doing them. And she thinks that because she has these unwanted thoughts that she can't control, that must mean she is some kind of monster. So this actually was kind of hard for me to read as someone who has OCD. Not this specific kind of OCD, but if you have OCD, this is a very OCD thought. And you read or hear about people who have OCD, there is this fear in your mind, like, uh-oh, what if I am gonna end up having those kinds of thoughts? And that's literally what I thought. But, I think it was some good exposure. So what I thought was really well done was the author was really able to craft an atmosphere in a way that was deeply unsettling in the mundane. There is just something slightly eerie about this novel from start to finish that is difficult to pinpoint, even when she's living in NYC and before she's completely upended her life. Like, these little details where Cassie is talking to her girlfriend and I think her roommate, and she just mentions that, oh yeah, and this guy is just like following me around. I have a stalker. And they're like, what? There's just something so ominous and foreboding about it, and I thought that was really well done. I definitely recommend this book. I think it's a great fall read for this time of year, and I would rate it 4 stars. So the next book I read was another Lending Library book, and that was Banyan Moon by Thao. I'm so sorry, I'm not going to say this name right. This is a multi-generational family saga following 3 Vietnamese women, and they are settled in this house they call the Banyan house in Florida. And so we begin where the granddaughter, the youngest, Anne, has flown back to Florida. She's just found out that her long-term boyfriend has been cheating on her, and she also happens to be pregnant. And she comes back to Florida because her grandmother, Min, has recently died. And the daughter, Anne's mother, Huang, has this very tense, complicated relationship with Anne. Anne was closer to her grandmother, Min, than she has been to Huang. And so there is also, meanwhile, a ghost aspect to this. Min's spirit is lingering in the present at the house, and we sort of get her perspective. But then we also go back in time in the story to both Min and Huang. Min in the 1960s in Vietnam, and Huang as a new wife and young mother in the 1990s. I thought what was really well done was crafting domestic violence in a marriage that is so unhealthy and dangerous. And we see in the beginning how when Huang is with, I forget the father's name, Anne's dad, her husband, he starts off really kind and sweet and like actively pursues her. And then we see how the mask starts to drop, and we see how he becomes emotionally abusive, and then how that spirals into physical abuse. And I thought that was portraying how abuse builds up over time. I thought that was really well done and the most compelling. Essentially, this novel is about like this multi-generational story of technically 2 women who are reconciling with their past and the present and trying to mend these fractured relationships, right? But there were honestly some things about this I didn't really care for, and I think it was just like my own personal opinion. And one was, I think the way we talk about, or the way the author sort of portrays motherhood and fathers. All the men in this story are like deadbeats or abusers, including this guy that Anne ends up seeing like a high school sweetheart while she is living in Florida. And also as well as her baby daddy, who's also a loser. And I feel like the way Anne broaches the relationship with her baby daddy and the high school love she reconnects with, it was just sort of like made it seem like it was women's innate duty to be the sole raiser of children. And if the father comes along for the ride, that's great, but it's not a big deal because that's women's primary role. And I felt like, I mean, that happens a lot, but I felt like the book seemed to think like that was just how it was, and it didn't challenge that. And I feel like that should be challenged. I don't know, like there's one point Anne says where she's talking about art and all the things she's created because she's an artist, and she's like, oh, the greatest thing I ever did was, and she gestures to her stomach, and I was like, really? Okay. And then there was also another weird sort of like centrist political aspect to it. There wasn't really a lot of time in Vietnam with the grandmother and her story, but I honestly wasn't expecting to read this from like the South Vietnamese perspective, and I felt like it didn't really add nuance. And when it did, it seemed to be like, oh, both sides, right? That like typical centrist thing. And it paints the Viet Cong as the bad people and the Americans were the allies, and that rubbed me the wrong way. Because whatever the atrocities the Viet Cong committed against other Vietnamese, that pales in comparison to what the U.S. did on a massive scale. And I don't think like that's a radical position to have. But like I felt like that was in this book, and I was like, am I going crazy? Like why are we apologizing for the Vietnam War in this book? So yeah, though that aspect of like the weird U.S. like pro-U.S. like shitty centrist and like pro-natalist politics, they just rub me the wrong way because that's how I feel personally. So I didn't think it was a bad book by any means, but I would have to say it's more of like a 3.5-star book. It just, you know, those aspects to it, and I don't know, the things even at the end with Anne and the father of her baby, I just found a little bit unbelievable, but whatever. Yeah. Okay, and we're back. And this is part 2 of this video where I go into the next 5 books I've read. Different outfit. So the 5th book I read in the month of October was We Love You, Bunny by Mona Awad. This is the kind of sequel, but most of it takes place in all of the events that happened prior to Bunny. So it's sort of like the prequel. So in this book, you probably are going to have to read Bunny, the first book, to really understand what's going on. I don't think this would really hold up well as a standalone. So be forewarned that I am going to kind of give away a couple spoilers in Bunny if you want to read it, so you can skip ahead if you haven't yet. But in this book, the 4 bunnies from the original kidnap Samantha, the main character, after she has had this successful book publication and tour. And her book was about, presumably, what happened her last semester of the MFA program. And so the present in this is Samantha being held hostage in an attic while the 4 bunnies each tell their side of the story. And so we get each different chapter in the beginning follows each of the 4 girls in their first year at the MFA program, their backstory, how they met, their writing, etc., etc. I felt like what Mona Awad was doing in this book was, and people have mentioned this as well online, is she was writing from as a response to different interpretations of her work, and it's almost like she, through the bunnies, wanted to set the story straight in terms of how she felt people should be interpreting her work, and I kind of don't like that because my interpretation was apparently very different. I liked the ambiguity, and I liked the idea of sort of straddling the line of, is this fantasy and are these things really happening, versus is Samantha actually mentally unwell? Is this a type of schizophrenia? And in this book, spoiler alert to Bunny, she's essentially saying, Mona Awad essentially is saying, no, these things actually happened. They were actually creating these men, these drafts, that not just themselves, the girls and Samantha, but other people who aren't even writers can see and interact with. And so a huge chunk of the novel, I would say it's about 50%, follows the perspective of one of their drafts named Arius. He's named after an allergy medicine that is not sold. The brand name is not sold here in the United States under that name. And it's essentially, this becomes a story that was previously sort of like a dark academia, female friendship, rivalries, a little bit of like Fight Club mixed in with A Beautiful Mind. It then becomes like a modern day Frankenstein, and I don't know if it was really... I feel like to write like you're writing a new Frankenstein is a pretty big... Those are big shoes to fill, and I don't know if it quite lived up to that. The Arius section was way too long. I think it could have been cut. It started out funny because he's this sort of essentially someone who was born yesterday and he doesn't understand anything. And the only thing that he really knows is the girls, the bunnies' main wish fulfillment, which is to exact revenge on their professor, Alan, because he criticizes them. So his whole goal is to kill Alan. And so there's all of these missteps that happen along the way, and it's funny at first, but then it gets tiring. It's also written in the style of a lot of little like emoticons, like happy and sad faces after every couple sentence, and I think that kind of gets a bit old quickly. I almost feel, I know Mona Awad is a fan of Bret Easton Ellis' American Psycho, and I kind of feel like she wanted to write a modern day American Psycho mixed in with Frankenstein. So this just, I don't know, it does, like I said, it goes against the ambiguity of the book. I feel like it takes away that mystery and the own interpretations I think that people had and could put on the book. And I don't think this was her worst. I still think Rouge is her worst written, but it's not as good as her other works. It's not as good as Bunny, and it's not as good as All's Well. And I do feel like, I don't know, but again, this and Rouge were released more recently. I feel like the way Mona Awad writes, it almost gives someone who is too chronically online, and it's coming out in her writing. And I don't know how else to really describe that, but it's almost like this weird TikTokification of writing. It's like almost the writing is trying too hard to be edgy, but it's also slightly dumbed down. Hard to explain. So yeah, it's just not really worth the wait. I would just say this is just mid and really pales in comparison to the first, so I would rate it 3 stars. The next book I finished in October was The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. I had mentioned this in a previous video of my spooky TBR. And so this is a Victorian Gothic sort of ghost story, I guess you could say. It is historical fiction, and it takes place sometime in like 1860s England. And the main character is a woman named Elsie Bainbridge, who is recently married and widowed. She was married to this man who was a wealthy heir, and then he died under mysterious circumstances, and so she's going to live on his old estate out in the English countryside. And so while she's there, she's living with, besides the servants in this really old, dilapidated estate, she's also living with his sister, Sarah. And there are a couple different timelines that are going on here. So we have Elsie and Sarah and life at the bridge in the 1860s. And then we also have, alternating every couple chapters, a story at the bridge in the 1630s of Elsie's late husband's, one of his ancestors named Anne, who was thought of as a witch, right? And at the bridge, Elsie discovers in the attic these silent companions. They are essentially these flat wooden figures. They're not statues because they're completely flat. And they all have, they almost look like they were cut out of a painting. And apparently this is like a real thing. And there's one in particular that sort of resembles her a little bit, and it's pretty weird. And so her sister-in-law, Sarah, takes them out of the attic, and she's like, "Oh, I love these. Like, let's put them around the estate, the house, whatever." And over time, they begin to notice that these figures are moving. They're changing positions and being dragged across the floor mysteriously, and the faces are changing, and more of these silent companions keep popping up. And so Sarah becomes obsessed with, she goes back into this attic, and she's like reading the diary of her ancestor, Anne. And so we follow Anne's story, like I said, in the 1600s. Anne had this daughter who was this, she did not speak. She was sort of this, people felt the daughter was possessed. And the father was deeply ashamed of the daughter. And so we have this storyline in the 1600s, and we find out like how Anne acquired these silent companions. And then in the present, we have Elsie, who is slowly feels like she's being driven mad, not just by these companions, but the servants slowly end up becoming dead in the most gruesome ways. And so she and Sarah begin to fear for their life. We also have a third timeline in this where Elsie is in an insane asylum, presumably 1 year after these events occur. So yes, there's like 3 different timelines that are alternating in this. I did enjoy this. I don't know if it was particularly scary. It was a little unsettling, but I feel like it takes a lot for me to get scared when I'm reading. I'm much more easy to scare when I'm watching a film. I don't know, though. The only thing I didn't really care for the ending. There is an ambiguity in the ending, and so spoiler alert, I am gonna kind of spoil this because I feel like I do have to talk about it. It was the one thing I didn't like. Elsie, people in the insane asylum obviously think, because she's telling this tale, that she is going mad. And then the reader slowly begins to question it as well. And it kind of becomes up for interpretation as to whether this is actually demonic witchcraft with these possessions, or whether Elsie really did imagine the whole thing. And I suppose there's another interpretation that Sarah is behind everything, and that like she was the one making Elsie going insane. But I don't know. I don't know if I loved that ambiguity and potential of, is she slightly mad? Which is interesting because I liked that in Bunny, but I don't know if I really liked it in this one. I felt like it was a little bit of a cop-out, and I do feel like it is overused sometimes in more like lit fic type of novels, when it's like, you know, sometimes I just want a horror. I just want like a fantasy element. So yeah, here I just preferred it to be demonic witchcraft, but you know, this is more like my kind of horror. It's not super gory. Yeah, and I would rate it 4 stars. I would recommend it. The next book I read was another sort of horror book, and that was Carnality by Lina Wolff. This is a Swedish translation, and it was translated by Frank Perry. Okay, this was quite an odd book. Had a little bit of like Lynchian aspect to it. So in this book, we follow this woman named Benedeth. You'll learn her name later on. And she is a travel writer, and she gets this grant to travel to Madrid. She's Swedish. And in Madrid one night, she meets this man named Mercurio in a dark bar. And he starts telling her this really weird tale about how and why he is on the run for his life. And so we get this narration where he was obsessed with watching this weird underground internet show where people come on the show, and essentially there is a sort of it has like a reality TV component to it, but the people are humiliated. And it was something that was accessed really only kind of via like the dark web. There was like a cryptocurrency payment, and there was a special like encrypted password to access the show. And so Mercurio wanted to win back his ex-wife, Soledad. And so he and Soledad end up going on the show. And on this show, there are 3 different people. There is a man named Mr. Blue, a woman named Miss Pink, and this nun named Sol Lucia. Lucia. And they tell him that the only way he can win Soledad back is to sacrifice something. And so I won't say what, but these men from this mysterious agency, after he's on the show, contact him, and they're after him, and he's running for his life. And after he tells his tale to Benedeth, the main character, she takes pity on him, and she's like, yeah, like I'll host you at my place while you're on the run. What could go wrong? And they take a trip to somewhere. They take like a trip somewhere else in Spain on this like little island off the coast, and then some more things go wrong. And so that is like the first half of this novel. And then the second half, the nun, Sor Lucia, is involved in this story, and she comes back. And so we get an epistolary novel where Sol Lucia is writing letters to Benedeth while Benedeth is in prison. And so when we get the backstory to the history and the life of this nun and how and why she ended up becoming involved in this mysterious underground TV show. This was definitely a trip. I do feel like it kind of changes tone a little bit because the beginning is very ominous, and there is like a dark humor element to it. Like I said, it is sort of Lynchian. And then when we get into the letter writing aspect with the nun's perspective, it does kind of shift gears. So the tone changes. I will say that I thought that the letters, normally this is something I hate. I hate letter writing in novels. I feel like it is such a cop-out. I feel like it does not allow you to inhabit the characters in the world. But this I actually didn't mind. I think the narration was pretty solid, pretty complete and compelling, and you didn't even really feel like you were reading letters, so I didn't mind that. But I do think that sort of like eerie, ominous, twisting, Lynchian aspect did end up kind of dissolving a bit, and that was a bit of a disappointment. But overall, I haven't read anything like this, and I did enjoy it. It was a trip. It was definitely fun. So if you're looking for something spooky and that is a translation, I would recommend, and I rated this 4 stars. The next book I read was another translation, and this one was from Uruguay, and it's called Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias, translated from Spanish by Heather Cleary. This is a dystopian Cli-Fi, I guess you could say, climate change, sci-fi type of novel. Has some of like a pandemic element to it as well. In this story, there is a mysterious red algae that has taken over the water, and the fish and birds are now gone, and people slowly start to become sick and quarantined away. Food is scarce, and animal product is compounded up into like this consumable pink slime for hygienic purposes. And so we follow this main character, a young woman, I don't think she's ever named, who is essentially in this sort of freeze moment. You know, people have like this flight or fight or freeze response, and she, in the face of like this impending catastrophe, as more and more things around her start to get worse, she is stuck in place. And so this novel the writing is beautiful, but there's a lack of a cohesive plot. And I feel like in the case of a dystopian survival novel, that I prefer to have more of like a straightforward kind of like linear line, a character with a driving motivation, rather than just waffling. So an example of this I thought was done really well is Severance by Ling Ma. Much of this novel is about the main character sort of like navel-gazing about her relationship with her ex-husband, who is currently quarantined away in one of these quarantine centers, her relationship with her mother, And then her relationship with this young boy that she is nannying, who just wants to eat and eat everything in sight. And we flip around a lot between like the past and the present, and sometimes this might have been something lost in translation. Where we were in time was not always clear. There is this vagueness to, I think, this novel that could be a bit confusing, and each chapter also opens with a dialogue between these two unnamed speakers, presumably the main character and her ex-husband, but it's never clear, and they speak a lot in like these wispy philosophical tones that feel like abstract poetry. And so like that was my general thing with this novel. Like I said, they're beautiful lines and you could get a really good sense of this world, but it's just kind of like wallowing in this catastrophe that's happening around. I mean, I think maybe this is supposed to be like the main character's lack of like mobility and motivation maybe is like a stand-in for human indifference in the face of impending catastrophe like climate change or the pandemic, but it just wasn't really compelling enough for me. I wanted a little bit more of a plot. So yeah, I rated it 3 stars. It wasn't bad, but it felt longer than it was or than it needed to be. And then the last book I read in the month of October was another horror-themed book that I hadn't mentioned, and that was The Doll Collection by Ellen Datlow. Well, it was an anthology, so Ellen Datlow edited it, and it has 17 different stories in here. One of them is by one of my favorite authors, Joyce Carol Oates, and this was a reread for me. I read this about 10 years ago, so some of this, most of it, I did not remember. And so I think like most short story collections, this was sort of hit or miss. It's very rare for me to find a short story collection where I think every single story is solid. The overarching theme of this are essentially dolls and the creepiness of dolls, or people and their relationship to dolls, building their lives around dolls in some way. Some of the stuff is a little gory that I did not like. One of the stories, what was that called? Daniel's Theory About Dolls. That was pretty nasty. There's one story in here called After and Back Before that I really didn't understand the world we were in, and I felt like it was a Black Mirror episode, but not in a good way. I would say there was like 7 standout stories, which I think for a collection of 17 is actually pretty decent. So I liked Skin and Bone, Heroes and Villains. Skin and Bone is by, Tim Liban. Heroes and Villains is by Stephen Gallagher. The Doll Master by Joyce Carol Oates. That was a good one. Let's see. Homemade Masters. That actually wasn't even like, there's not even like a fantasy element to it. It was just an N-word doll. Almost some of this, not all of these were quite like horror fantastical. Some almost felt like creative nonfiction. No wonder I liked those at some of the most. Yeah, so like I said, it was sort of hit or miss. Some standouts, some forgettable, and then some just like straight up nasty, gory, gross, which I guess is what you're gonna get with horror. So like, you know, and yeah, I rated it, I ended up rating it 3.5 stars, but it is part of my collection. It was published by Tor. I got it there, so I am gonna keep it. But yeah, that wraps up my October wrap up. I did branch out a little bit this past month into horror, and I am going to still be reading a couple horror books in November because they just came in from my library late. So yeah, I am branching out, and I'm just kind of learning what horror works for me and what does not. So yeah, please let me know in the comments below what your favorite book was in October, if you have any good kind of horror, sort of lit fic-ish reads that you would recommend. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.